All right. I think everybody is starting to come in. We've got a good crowd, good turnout today. So thanks for joining us. I'm Catherine Hoffman. I'm the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And I'm going to be the facilitator for today's conversation. So I want to tell you a little bit about why we decided to do this webinar. We're seeing an influx of proposals of these big data centers here in Minnesota, and they intersect with our work in multiple ways. We see impacts on energy and climate, water, mining, and other things. And so as a staff, we had a lot of questions. So we've learned a lot more. And now we want to offer some of that to you as well. So we'll be talking about that today. As a couple of reminders before we get started here. The first one is that we are a nonprofit, and we are, what makes this work is that we're fueled by people like you. About half of our funding comes from individuals, and that makes our legal work defending the environment very powerful. And I will say in particular, this issue of data centers, foundations have not yet stepped in for funding. So we are relying on individual donors to help us fund the time for us to advocate on this issue. So if you enjoy this webinar, please do make a gift at the link in the chat. And if you're already a donor, thank you so much for your support. We appreciate you. Here's what we want to do with our time today. Amelia Voss is our Director of Climate and Energy. She's an attorney with MCEA. She's been with us about 6 years. Is that right, Amelia? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Right. She leads our work at the Public Utilities Commission, among other things. And she's going to kick us off with talking a little bit about what these data centers are and what's specifically happening in Minnesota and how this will affect our clean energy plans. Then I'm going to turn to Aaron Clems. Aaron is our Chief Strategy Officer here at MCEA. He directs our legislative and communication work, and he's going to be talking about some of the water and mining and other impacts. He's going to talk about what's happening at the legislature, and then we're going to wind up with what MCEA is doing and what you can do on this issue. We are planning to have about 15 minutes for your questions at the end. There are a lot of you on this call, so we will do our best. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll see how many we can get to. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So Amelia, can you start us off by giving us a primer on the 3 computing technologies that we're talking about here: artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, and data centers?
Absolutely. And I have some slides that I'm going to share here just to help make this really easy to understand. Does that look like a PowerPoint to you?
It does.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. So before I get into the different computing technologies, I just wanted to start from the very beginning and make sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say a data center. So when I use the words data center, what I'm referring to is basically a large warehouse style building that's housing computer equipment doing some kind of computing function inside. And then there's some variability about what kind of computing is happening and what kind of facility it is that I'll get into in a moment. This is a picture of the outside of a data center. So as you can see, it's fairly nondescript, just kind of looks like a big warehouse. A lot of them are around 100,000 square feet, which for context is about the size of a Target store. And then this is what the inside of a data center looks like. So inside you have thousands of rows of computer equipment that look like this. And that computer equipment can be doing a variety of different things. So it can be storing data, which we typically think of as cloud storage or the cloud. So if you're using Google Docs, or if you're using Google Cloud Storage or Microsoft Cloud Storage, that cloud storage is happening at a data center. They also have computers that process data. So basically, anytime we're interacting with the internet, doing a Google search, streaming a video, that's processing through computing at a data center. Data centers also process artificial intelligence queries. So if you've used a large language model, I think the one that most people are familiar with is ChatGPT. If you've typed in a question to ChatGPT, someplace at a data center that is being processed through equipment at a data center. And then the computing equipment at data centers also is used to train those large language models, and so that they can produce good responses to your search queries. That requires a lot of computing power. That happens at data centers. And then the last core thing that happens inside a data center is mining cryptocurrency. And that requires using, big, powerful computers that are solving complex math problems. And the reward for that is cryptocurrency. So that kind of computing is happening inside a data center too. So interestingly, we all use data centers every day and basically have been using them since we started using the internet. But I can certainly say I never really thought about my interaction with data centers on a daily basis until it started being an issue that was in the news. And I just want to share a little bit more background on the kind of main types of data centers you'll see. I think it's important to understand that there are different types of data centers because the benefits and drawbacks of each are a little bit different. So, when you're reading the news, it's important to know what kind of data center they're talking about. The most important data center, I think, for people to know about is the hyperscale or hyperscaler data center. These are the largest data centers in terms of physical size. They, in the United States, tend to be operated by our four major tech companies. So Google, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft. And inside of these data centers, they're doing most of the things we just talked about. They're storing data, processing data, AI searches, AI training. And these hyperscale data centers are getting the most attention in the news lately because they're growing at such an exponential pace. And so if you're reading an article in the news or watching the news and you're seeing a discussion of a data center that's going to be owned by Google, Amazon, Meta, or Microsoft, really good chance it's the hyperscale type data center. There are also much more moderately sized data centers, and we've had many of these in Minnesota for a long time. So an enterprise type data center or a co-location type data center are both a smaller, more moderately sized facility. And an example of one of those is if you're familiar with Thomson Reuters, Minnesota company that owns the Westlaw database, which lawyers use to look up law. They have their own data center on site at their campus in Minnesota. It's housing the computers that produce the search results. That data center has been there for a long time, but it's a smaller facility than the hyperscale size. And then the last main bucket of data centers I just want people to be aware of is those that are really exclusively doing cryptocurrency mining. These can tend to look fairly different from other data centers. They can be built even in a shipping container and then moved around the country to take advantage of where electricity prices are cheap. And so a crypto mining data center, because it can be a little bit fly by night and more mobile, often has different issues than a hyperscale data center, and certainly, functions differently as a hyperscale data center is so big, it's not going anywhere. It is not mobile. It is where it is, whereas a crypto mining data center could be mobile.
Gotcha. Okay, that's super helpful overview. So now let's zoom in on Minnesota, where we're focused on the data centers in particular. And as Amelia mentioned, there are more and more stories in the media about these as well. They're popping up in different communities around the state. So staying with Amelia for a moment, can you bring us up to speed for what's happening with these data center proposals right now? And what are the proponents saying are the potential upsides of these facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just share a few more slides I think that will be helpful. So let's start with what's going on in Minnesota in terms of data center proposals. A recent investigation from the Star Tribune reported that there are 10 data centers proposed for Minnesota currently. And to be clear, we already have a number of data centers, although we don't have as many of these big hyperscale data centers, which tend to be what the new proposals are for. The growth of the industry has really been happening. I'm sure you've felt like, gosh, I'm seeing a lot of this in the news really recently. The growth seems to really be triggered by artificial intelligence and the race of different technology companies to be a leader in artificial intelligence, which is part of the reason we're seeing so many proposals in Minnesota all of a sudden. And I did just want to note before we talk about specific proposals in Minnesota, we are not the only state that has an influx of new data center proposals. In fact, we aren't even in the top 10 of states that have new proposals. Virginia has really had the greatest data center growth, and then Dallas, Silicon Valley, Chicago. So this is something that's kind of popped up recently all over the country, but also including Minnesota. So turning to some of the specific proposals here, there's a hyperscale facility slated for Rosemount, Minnesota, that would be owned by Meta, also known as, or formerly known as Facebook. By my calculation, back of the envelope, it'd be like the size of roughly 7 Target stores. Then you may have also read about the data center proposed for Farmington. That is also a hyperscale facility. That one would be a little bit bigger, up to maybe about 25 Target stores. So that's a pretty big facility. And that one's been pretty controversial because it's located next to a residential neighborhood and would really change the tenor of that neighborhood from living next to a natural area to something fairly industrial. There's also 2 hyperscale facilities proposed for Becker, one owned by Amazon, one owned by Microsoft. And then other sites that we're aware of are Apple Valley, North Mankato, Chaska, Faribault, and Hampton. Not all of those are hyperscale facilities, however. Some may be, but not all. And then turning briefly to kind of the touted benefits of data centers. So all of these projects could have benefits. They could bring local tax revenue that's invested kind of in the local area, in city, county, and school districts. They can also bring jobs. So, for example, that facility in Rosemount, owned by Meta, says that they will create 1,000 construction jobs and then 100 long-term jobs. We've also seen data centers fund community programs or community benefit programs. So an example of this is, again, that Meta facility in Rosemount. Meta has said that they are going to fund a grant program that would provide funding to nonprofits and schools for STEM education. We've also seen some data centers be willing to pay for bringing wind and solar and clean energy to help power their facilities, or to help pay for new innovative technologies that would really help a state move forward on the clean energy transition, but is a technology that's either so new or so new and expensive that it hasn't really been widely adopted. So trying to help kind of overcome that initial hump and bring it to a state. And then another touted benefit is that there's a potential for data centers to reduce electricity rates for all customers by adding such a large customer to the system and spreading costs over a larger group of people or a larger array. I will note that I say these projects could have benefits because a lot of these things I think sound great, but they are voluntary. They rely on a big corporation wanting to do a good thing voluntarily, or certain state policies to be designed a certain way, or decision makers to make decisions in a certain way. And so very little on this list is actually guaranteed. A lot of it really requires, do-gooding actions or different things to go right. So, for example, the community programs, bringing clean energy, bringing innovative technologies, all of those just rely on the data center company saying, hey, we want to do this. Similarly, the tax revenue piece is kind of being hotly debated at the legislature right now, and I think we'll talk about that further momentarily, but that's a policy decision that will really affect whether that benefit materializes. And whether electricity rates go down for customers really depends on how that's designed by our Public Utilities Commission, who just last week made a decision to do some work looking into how to design this well. So that's exciting, and I'm keeping an eye on that. But all of this requires some things to go right, or a lot of things to go right, in order for the benefits to materialize.
Right. Thanks, Amelia. So having looked at some of those potential upsides, let's take a look at some of the potential risks. One of the reasons that MCEA is interested in this emerging issue is because it has implications across their work. So I want to start with Aaron. So Aaron, can you talk to us about the potential impacts of data centers and specifically on water resources and metal resources or mining?
Thanks, Catherine. I would love to. And I think it's interesting to start with the water and materials impacts because so much of the emphasis has been on the electricity demand that these centers would draw. And Amelia will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, I think. But I do want to spend some time developing some of these ideas that people are maybe not aware of, which particularly has to do with our water consumption and our materials consumption. Uh, the Farmington proposal that Amelia just mentioned, in their environmental review documents, they said that they would use up to 900 million gallons a year of water, effectively doubling the water consumption of the city of Farmington. So that's just for one proposal. The reason why these proposals tend to use a lot of water is because they use that water for cooling. And the way that it's used, and the most inefficient way it's used, is what's called single pass cooling. And that's where you basically pump groundwater out of the ground and then use it to cool the hot and the computing equipment that generates a lot of heat. And then you just dump that water into the sewer. Um, we've used single pass cooling for a lot of things for a long time. I can recall back in the 80s this being a concern about cooling buildings using single pass cooling. But because it's inexpensive and because water can be generally pretty easy to access, a lot of corporations start there because it's the cheapest and fastest way to cool their equipment. But this is a real problem for us here in Minnesota. We do not have an unlimited groundwater supply, and quite honestly, we don't have a great system sometimes in deciding whether or not water appropriation permits are deserved or whether there are risks to them. There are also technological solutions involving closed loop systems or other ways to reduce the amount of water consumption, but those are more expensive than the cheapest and fastest way to do it, which is the single pass cooling system. The Farmington example is another good example of one of the flaws in how we look at this, or one of the gaps in how Minnesota currently looks at the water risks, because many times proposals, and the Farmington proposal is one of them, they will piggyback on a city's water permit. They will not go out and get a new water permit for themselves for their water consumption, but rather they'll rely on a municipality to supply them water for their facility. The same water that city would provide to a residential customer, for example, for drinking water. The problem is that there's a little bit less scrutiny, I think, about, and it's politically difficult to say no to a city that wants to expand their water appropriation permit. It's a lot different than saying we're going to look, on one level, we're going to look specifically at this proposal and whether this proposal's use of water is effective or right. Oftentimes, cities, by taking on the responsibility of providing water, kind of shield the individual proposer from that. And there are cumulative impacts. I mean, this proposal in Farmington is 12 miles north of the Elko Newmarket Niagara bottling plant, which you may recall from last year. It's going to draw about 365 million gallons of water from the same aquifer in an area where there's already a depression developing, where the amount of the water level is falling because it's being drawn on by so many different sources. You may have also seen an article in the Star Tribune this Sunday talking about explosive new residential growth in Elko Newmarket. So at the same time, we're inviting these industries into this area of the state, and they're drawing a lot of water. There's a lot of other draws on the same water supplies, and this is the same water that people depend on for their drinking water. And so there's a lot of concern about that. Lastly, I'll just add that sometimes surface water impacts can happen too. A lot of surface water, so for example, nearby there's the Vermilion River. It's a trout stream. The Vermilion River is cold and it has a population of trout because of the groundwater that feeds it. So if the groundwater table were to drop, there could be impacts on that Vermilion River surface water as well. And that could affect both angling and stuff like that, but also just aquatic life in that stream. I also wanted to just talk a little bit about the demand for metals in mining. Because as you saw from the pictures earlier, like this is a giant building filled with lots of server racks and lots of metal. And these metals include things like iron, copper, gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. All things that we are paying close attention to in part because of proposals to mine those same minerals in northern Minnesota. After years of hearing from opponents concerned about the metals impact of installing solar and wind proposals, we haven't really seen the same level of concern about the metals use in these particular proposals for data centers. And this is not going to just be a one-time problem. Even if you build a very large facility, you're not done with it as soon as you build it. In fact, all this computing equipment needs to be replaced on a regular schedule, about once every 3 years, from what we understand is the industry standard. So imagine having to empty that 2.5 million square foot facility and refill it with new computers every 3 years. That really adds up quickly. And we're really concerned that there's not been any emphasis or attention paid to that particular part of the problem. So those are the water and materials use impacts, and I think that Amelia might be able to expand a little bit more on the energy impacts.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it's safe to assume that that increased demand in metals, Minnesota's been very much in the crosshairs in terms of our potential mineral reserves. So that's an important one. Yeah, let's go to Amelia. Can you talk a little bit about the concerns as they relate to energy consumption and especially our clean energy goals here in Minnesota?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure, everybody who's read an article about data centers has heard they have a huge electricity need. It takes so much electricity to power a data center. And I read in the Star Tribune that the current proposals in Minnesota would require the same amount of electricity as all the homes in Minnesota. So as you can imagine, if we, in very short order, doubled the amount of homes in Minnesota, we'd have to build more things to generate electricity to serve all that need. One tricky piece of this puzzle is that if a data center locates in a utility's territory, that utility has a legal obligation to provide them with electricity. So if they're there, the utility has to come up with a plan for how to serve them. And so the question has really become, how do we build enough electricity generation to serve that need? And what do we build? And also, I think is another important question, who pays for it? And so the concern really is that there's a real risk that because they require so much electricity, that could result in either planned coal plants that we were planning to stop using, still being used much longer into the future. And so when we stop using a coal plant, it's called retiring that coal plant. And there's a real concern, and we've seen in some other states that the growth of data centers has caused retirement dates for coal plants to get really pushed out. Or we've also seen, for example, in Wisconsin, there's a Microsoft data center that is resulting in the build out of a number of new gas plants at a time, where we're really trying to move rapidly away from both coal and gas as part of the clean energy transition. And of course, we in Minnesota have the 100% carbon free by 2040 law, which requires our electric utilities to provide customers with 100% carbon-free electricity by that date. And so how data centers are going to affect achievement of that is a real big open question that I think everybody should be asking. If they're coming and we have to serve them with electricity, how are we going to do this in a way that doesn't derail climate progress, doesn't result in the build out of a lot of new fossil fuels? And if there isn't a way to serve them without building out a lot of new fossil fuels, what opportunity do we have to say no? So there's a lot of big, tricky questions there on the climate side.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Amelia. All right, so that's on the energy side. This is coming up a lot at the legislature, I hear as well. Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is probably the hottest topic at the legislature right now that no one really anticipated, quite honestly, going into the session. And I think that as we've gone through some of the debates on the bills that have been offered so far, it's become really obvious to MCEA folks that there's not a good framework in place for making the decision about whether or not a proposal or a set of proposals are good for Minnesota. As Amelia just said, they're required to serve that any customer, including a data center with electricity. There's very, I would say, insufficient oversight over the water appropriations that are being used, and there's virtually no attention being paid to the metals that are being used. And so one of the things that we're really hoping to see at this legislative session is some bills to emerge that address the kind of all the facets of the data center dilemma as it's posed to Minnesotans. But so far, that's not been the case. The bills that have advanced at the legislature have been mostly either giveaways to industry or reductions in oversight on that on this industry. So to give you two examples, these bills are both being heard tomorrow morning, actually tomorrow morning and afternoon, in the House Taxes Committee and the House Environment Committee. The taxes bill is a bill that would make it even easier for the largest data centers to get their tax breaks. Any data center that's worth more than $250 million would be able to get sales tax exemptions up front. They just wouldn't pay sales taxes on their electricity that they use, on the computer equipment that they install, and on the software that they use. Right now in Minnesota, we've had a law on the books since 2011 that gives tax rebates to data centers. And when it was passed in 2011, this was a fairly minor issue. They estimated about $5 million a year in fiscal impact from that tax credit. And while we don't know the exact number for this year, given the explosion of interest, it could be as high as 250 million or getting closer to $1 billion over time. Remember, this is not a one-time exemption. Every time they refurbish those centers, every time they purchase electricity, they receive a tax rebate or a tax exemption. And so the bills that are in front of the legislature right now on taxes are both pretty bad in the sense that they would only allow, they wouldn't limit the tax credit. They would extend it to 2050. And they would also allow the largest users to do so in a way that we would never even really know how much taxes they have been exempted from. Whereas at least in the current system, you have to submit your receipts and get a refund. The other bill that this is being heard tomorrow that's been making its way through the Capitol is a bill that would exempt diesel generators from environmental review. You may have seen coverage of the Becker data center. They proposed to build 250 diesel generators to provide uninterruptible power in case of a power outage. 250 diesel generators is an awful lot. I mean, that's basically that's the equivalent of the output of the nuclear power plant at Monticello, for example. That's how big that is. And living next to a site with that many generators operating is a real problem, both for air quality and noise. And I'd also add here, it's not that it would only go on during an emergency. They would have to continually test these operating diesel generators to make sure that they're available at the time of emergency. So they have to be usually tested on a monthly or even weekly basis to ensure that they're working, they have fuel, etc. These are part of the reasons why there's been another bill that's been introduced that's useful is would limit the zoning of these proposals to industrial zones in cities. Given the nature of the noise they produce, the huge size of these proposals, and the fact that they're not appropriately sited immediately next to a residential area. A number of folks have introduced bills. Senator Liskey and Representative Roach, who both represent the Farmington area, have introduced a bill that would prohibit zoning, putting this in any zone other than an industrial zone. And so there's actually some bipartisan and interesting interest in this area that gives me some hope that we're going to come up with some bipartisan and balanced solutions for this. But so far, we're still waiting for some good bills to emerge to really put the point on the amount of water we're using, address the metals that we're using, and also make sure that the energy that they draw wouldn't reduce reliability or increase cost on consumers.
Okay, thanks. So that does sound like a lot happening at the legislature. So thanks for setting the stage for us. And it seems like it's really important for our leaders to understand the pros and cons here as well, and our decision makers, and to communicate with those folks. So and I'll stick with Aaron on this one, what is MCEA doing to make sure that the decision makers are well informed, and what can the public do?
Well, first of all, we're talking to them. I mean, that sounds kind of simple, but we've had a lot of folks, public utilities commissioners, legislators, chairs of committees, reaching out to us, wondering what to do. And that's kind of where we're at. I think a lot of folks are trying to figure out what the appropriate response is to this new wave of interest in Minnesota as a location for these data centers. And what MCEA is doing in response is developing a clear position and trying to come up with the questions that Minnesotans need to get answers to. before we make a commitment to provide massive tax breaks to big tech companies, huge electricity draws, and big slurps out of our drinking water supply. And we're going to be working, finalizing that in the week or so coming, and then we'll be putting that out there for the public and for decision makers to see. Right. So that's one of the things we're doing, is just trying to get our ducks in a row and understand the scope of the problem. And I think you've heard today that we've got a lot of information that we've been trying to go through to process that and create a position that makes sense for Minnesota. Secondly, we're opposing bad ideas. And there are some really bad ideas at the legislature right now. And so one of them is an online action that you can take today that would send a message that you oppose open-ended free tax breaks for the biggest tech companies that have ever existed on the planet. The biggest companies and the wealthiest companies that have ever existed on the planet Earth are the ones that we are giving hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks to in Minnesota. So we hope you'll join us in that action and oppose both the bill that would extend that, but also encourage our legislators to take a hard look at whether or not we should be giving tax breaks at all to these companies. And this is where this comes down to like the really basic stuff too, guys. Like, bring it up with your legislators. Talk to people that are making decisions about this and tell them you're concerned about it. Ask them what they're doing to prevent bad things from happening to Minnesotans from these proposals. They need to know that there are people that are wondering and the same way that they are, and encouraging them to take action. And lastly, this is kind of a weird one, but learn if there's anything proposed in your community. I mean, we are finding data center proposals left and right that our friends, supporters, and donors are sending to us saying, is this something that I should be paying attention to? And the answer is usually yes. But if you see any data center proposed for your community and you're not sure that folks know about it, let us know, and also become educated yourself on what's being proposed in your community. Those are the things that I would suggest at this point. But as you're getting from this overall webinar, we're just trying to learn alongside everybody else, like what the risks are, and come up with a good strategy for responding to it to ensure that Minnesotans are protected and our drinking water supply is protected, and that we're not undermining our clean energy goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's already somebody in the Q&A who's weighed in that there are additional proposals in Rosemont that we may not be familiar with. And that's how quickly this thing is moving. So that's helpful information for us, because this is a quickly evolving issue. And it's one that, as Aaron said, we're still kind of researching and unpacking. There's only so much we can do in a 1-hour webinar, but hopefully this has given you a sense of, the issue overall. So given this conversation today, and before we open things up to the questions, and there are a lot of questions, I'm wondering if either of you have final thoughts that you want to share on what you hope the takeaway is today for today's listeners. Maybe I'll start with Amelia.
Yeah, so I work on climate change, so my big takeaway is climate focused. But I've just been really thinking about how Minnesota has been a leader in the clean energy transition. We have the 100% law, and so many people have made changes, policy changes, business changes that are helping us reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transition to clean energy. And I just really worry that this one industry, data centers, has the potential to set back all of that progress that required so many people to come together in Minnesota to make. And so I'm hoping that decision makers, people, citizens are really thinking about that, and that as a core cost of data centers, and evaluating that against some of the touted benefits, and assessing, can we afford to have this here? What is the repercussion? What is the impact? Because we can't have one industry set back all of the progress we've made on decarbonizing our electric system. And we have seen in a lot of other places that data centers are being served with fossil fuels. So I think it's a real serious risk that we need to account for, and we can't just have the plan B. We're going to build some more gas to serve them and buy renewable energy credits to offset it, and that's how we're going to comply with our 100% law. We need to really not build new fossil. So are we making sure that if this industry is coming here, we have a plan that allows them to come here without building a bunch of new fossil fuel infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a big question, Amelia. Thanks. What about you, Aaron? What's your takeaway?
Well, as we dug into this more, we just realized that there's no one at the state level that's making any overarching central decision about whether a proposal is good or bad. And so many of these decisions are being made only at the local unit of government level, where they become the decider about where to zone things, whether to approve a proposal, et cetera. And oftentimes they also do the environmental review of the environmental impacts for that proposal. And we've also seen that sometimes local units of government have gone to pretty some pretty good lengths to try to create secrecy or to avoid disclosing who the name of the owner of these proposals would be. The Rosemount facility we've been talking about earlier, they had I forgot the code name they had, but they had a code name for it or something like that. Which nothing says we're open and transparent more than hiding even the name of the thing you're proposing. And also, like, we don't know, for example, who ends up owning it. There's a developer named Tract that is responsible for the Farmington proposal. Tract is not going to own the data center. They will sell it to somebody else. They're actually probably acting as the agent for some other corporation that wants to buy it. We don't even know who that is. So a circumstance where we don't have good information, and there's not one centralized decision maker, and also where big impacts, especially on water and materials use, are not being considered by really anybody. I mean, I should say, I'd be clear, the Department of Natural Resources has to give a permit for water appropriation permits. I'm not saying they don't do that, but we also don't see a broader effort to decide whether or not there's sustainable water resources in the area that we're, as some folks have been noting in the question and answer, it's not just one proposal in Rosemount and one in Farmington. There's one in Hampton. There's multiple in Farmington. There's at least 5 in Rosemount. These are popping up all over the place. And so the cumulative impact of all these proposals is also another thing that we're really not paying attention to. So our goal is to create a regulatory framework. That sounds really boring, but what we really mean is there needs to be somebody asking the question, is this right for Minnesota? And do we have the resources necessary to sustain it? And right now, we don't see the broader question being asked or anybody having the authority to say no if the answer is no, it's not good for Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, we are lawyers, so we do love a good regulatory framework, as boring as it sounds. And I'm struck just listening to the two of you talk about this, how much we need MCEA on this problem, because it does require legal expertise and it's a multifaceted issue. We have a lot of amazing environmental groups here in Minnesota, and many of them are focused in a specific area. Maybe it's a watershed or body of water, maybe it's energy, maybe it's mining, but we work across those areas. And so I think this multifaceted problem needs a multifaceted approach. So it strikes me as a good issue for MCEA, and I'm glad that we're able to take this on. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A here a bit. There's a lot of great questions here. One of the things folks are asking about is, what are there federal laws that are helpful here that might apply, especially, if you've got the mobile crypto situations or other aspects of the centers?
I can do that one on. As far as I know, I mean, there's obviously the federal environmental laws that we're familiar with that we've worked on before, but most of them don't apply to something that's considered to be kind of I mean, it's more of a local land use issue in a lot of ways. I think we are concerned, though, to see some of the statements coming out of Washington, D.C. about the need for AI dominance, the need to dominate this area, and being willing to cut corners to get there. So we're worried that even the federal laws that exist now may become less available to us as tools to use, if they are tools that can be used to restrain it, because of the emphasis on developing AI, cryptocurrency, and other digital stuff as fast as possible, and without regard really for the long-term impact. I think there's a lot of really reckless rhetoric coming out of DC right now on this question alone, among other things too.
Yeah, not just that one, but yes, for sure. Yeah. Thanks. That's helpful. And so there's also a lot of questions here, Amelia, about the ability of what is the role of like the PUC and utilities? Like, can they, for example, require these centers to invest in renewable energy in order to power their facilities? Or, what regulatory tools do we have on that now?
Yeah. So it I would say it's an imperfect system, but there are options. So a utility that's going to provide service to a data center has to enter into a service agreement with them. And I think the utility actually has a lot of bargaining power in that process to say, okay, here's the terms in which we can provide you service, but we really want to see you help us, figure out how to serve you with clean energy, or, would you help us pay for a big battery that can, help serve our system but benefit you? So even though, some of those agreements might be outside of a typical service agreement, I do think that the utility has a lot of bargaining power to try and negotiate some beneficial things. Also, I mentioned this briefly, but the Public Utilities Commission just last week ordered Xcel to file a proposal to create a new customer class for data centers, and a new, basically, term sheet of how service to them would look, how Xcel would ensure that prices stay affordable, reliable, what electricity sources they would use to power these data centers. And so that is a new development that I'm really excited to see what comes out of it. But I think we're going to see some helpful information there be produced. How is Xcel thinking about this? How are they planning to do this, so we can understand, do they see a path forward where this remains not affecting customers' bills, where we still have reliable electricity, we still have clean electricity, or is it, going to be really hard to have data centers and have all of those things happen? So, and ideally, after Xcel, the commission will have other utilities do that too. But there are a couple avenues, but I think one thing we've highlighted here is that there isn't this perfect system where, for example, the Public Utilities Commission gets to say, well, this data center is going to sort of thwart a bunch of good things we have going on, so we're just not going to allow it to go forward. That isn't authority that the commission currently has.
Right.
Can I just pick back on one thing on that, which is that, so Friday, there will be a hearing at the Public Utilities Commission about another aspect of data center development, which is the backup power generators. That is also the subject of a bill that's being heard tomorrow at the Minnesota legislature, which would exempt the diesel backup generators that has been proposed for the Becker data center, particularly. That's actually the PUC document that's being decided on Friday. But this issue is in front of the legislature and the Public Utilities Commission at the same time. And it's kind of a testament to how little there is available for dealing with data center issues, that we're like focused on things like environmental review of the backup generators, as opposed to, I don't know, the 600 megawatts of power that they would draw, or the 900 million gallons of water that they would draw. But it is kind of it's a symptom of how little traction we have with the current regulatory framework, because we're relying on things that are really peripheral, I think, to what these proposals are and what the threat they are that they pose to local communities.
Yeah, and related to that, Aaron, there's a lot of questions about environmental review and what are the environmental review requirements. And you talked a little bit about these diesel generators. I mean, and just maybe I should say a little bit, I mean, for folks, environmental review, of course, is a study that facilities are required to go through before they are allowed to get a permit and move forward. And we do that as part of the study. They have to look at impacts and also opportunities to decrease or mitigate those impacts. And here in Minnesota, there's certain types of actions that make it mandatory that you have to go through environmental review. And outside of that, it becomes more discretionary on the part of agencies, whether they're going to require that study or not. So just so people kind of understand where that's at. So what do these data centers have to do right now in terms of environmental review?
So most of the data centers that we see popping up are going through what is called an alternative form of environmental review, called an alternative urban area-wide review. And we like to use abbreviations. So AUAR, if you ever hear that, that's what they're referring to. And this is something that was designed to be kind of a planning tool for municipalities. So imagine a municipality is planning to develop, a a 200-acre farm into a residential subdivision, but they're going to do it in multiple phases. The idea of the AUAR was you can plan out kind of, 15 years of different phases for that development and look at the overall impact of it. And and for that tool, it's great. But what's happened with AUAR is at the municipal level is now they're being used primarily, it seems, to conceal who owns these data centers and rolling in the data center proposal into an industrial park proposal, for example, and then doing environmental review through that AUAR process of the industrial park. Then there's a lot of, and then because this is an unusual kind of form of environmental review, it's being used to shield sometimes the identity of who is proposing this, what they are proposing, and what the impacts might be. To the point where we've seen comments filed on some of these environmental review documents from state agencies, including the ones looking at water, saying you haven't done a good enough job on water. So we're looking into this question too, because it appears to us that the environmental review process, by using this alternative form, has been kind of a way of shielding the companies that are proposing it from more rigorous looks at what their environmental impacts might be, but also being used as a tool to avoid scrutiny of who's making the proposal at all. If you look at all the data center proposals that have been going through environmental review, nearly all of them use this alternative process as opposed to doing an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, which are the ones that we're more familiar with.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that. I think one of the things that's really frustrating about that is that environmental review is one of the best and sometimes only opportunities for the public to get involved in a project, have their voice heard, raise questions, ask questions, have those questions answered. And, when a community hears, oh, well, there's a proposal to turn this area off of highway so-and-so into an industrial park, that may not, raise someone's interest as, oh, I want to learn more. I want to engage in that. If the proposal was, hey, we're planning to turn it into a data center, that might really pique interest and people would want to know about that. But because it's going through this AUAR process, which allows them to just say sort of very high level, generally, we're going to, rezone this area into something light industrial. I think it ends up being sort of a secretive process or a missed opportunity where the public would normally have an opportunity to engage, but because they don't know that what's actually behind that coded language is a data center, then the opportunity to engage with that environmental review process has passed. And so I would really like to see, and it may require some regulation change in Minnesota, but I would like to see a requirement that data centers have to go through either the EAW or the EIS process, which is much more transparent and familiar to people who have, watched a project go through environmental review before.
Right. I mean, environmental review is really, I think, a key part of what makes Minnesota a state with strong public participation and transparency is, it's really a cornerstone of our democracy in some ways, that you as a citizen have an opportunity to weigh in on, what you live near and how our natural resources are used. And if we're bypassing that step, then that's bypassing the public. And that's really, I think, steamrolling our democracy in a way that we shouldn't be doing. And you referenced some local impacts, Amelia, and I want to follow up there because there are a lot of questions about the noise and light impacts that neighbors might be experiencing. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, and it can depend on which kind of data center it is, what the impacts will be, but one really common impact is noise, and there can be just kind of a constant sort of machine hum that you experience living next to data centers that just never stops. And, studies have shown that can, really cause some anxiety, some mental health challenges, just because, it's just always there, similar to light pollution, something that's always on and, it can just, it's something that maybe sounds small, but I think we've seen data that shows it really can take its toll on residents living next to a facility. And you can actually, if you Google, I've seen some articles that actually have a video that will play the sound of what the noise sounds like if you're curious and want to hear what it sounds like. But if you listen to it, it definitely isn't something that I would want to live next to. I can say that.
One quick example of that is in Glencoe, Minnesota. There has been a crypto mining, a Bitcoin mining operation that's right next to residential homes and has basically an 85 to 90 decibel constant whine from exhaust fans. And you can only imagine the difference between living next to an open field and then having an operation move in next door and have a constant noise, in your backyard. So that's one of the reasons why they are loud is they require a lot of cooling, and those fans tend to generate a lot of noise.
Yeah. So there's a few questions hanging around in terms of potential benefits as Minnesota as a technology hub or attracting more business, and also kind of the notion that, if they're not here, they'll be somewhere else, and maybe that could be worse. Some of these ideas swirling around. Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that, but I want to throw that to the panelists first and see if you all have any reactions to those arguments.
So
go ahead, Aaron.
one thing is just the siting of these things has less to do with like developing a technology industry than it does availability of water and electricity, right? So one of the reasons why we're seeing a sudden interest in Minnesota is because we have one of the laws that Amelia mentioned, which is you have to supply them with electricity, relatively lax regulation of water use. And also some of these companies really do care about renewable energy. They have specific goals in their corporate documents, and they're going to be 100% renewable by a certain date. And Minnesota has a law that's moving us in that direction quite quickly. So that makes us desirable in that way. As far as whether or not this attracts corresponding benefits, one of the things that's really clear about these proposals is they are not big job generators. At the construction phase, they may generate a lot of jobs for construction of these facilities. But as far as creating permanent jobs, most of them are in the dozens rather than hundreds. And so we don't really see this as being a big long-term economic benefit to the state, although, as Amelia described earlier, there are benefits or potential benefits for these proposals. They also come at some pretty significant costs.
Yeah, and I think, what I'd like to add is I've heard some legislators talk about this as sort of this huge opportunity for, young people coming out of college. And I would be curious, somebody please correct me if I'm not understanding, but, as I see it, these are basically computer warehouses, right? And the people working in them are working on maintaining the equipment, fixing the equipment. But a lot of the jobs that I hear legislators or other people talking about are jobs in AI, jobs in, computers and technology. And those are happening at home where people are working those jobs from wherever they are. They're not working those jobs from the data center. So to me, the data center is kind of the same as if you, said, hey, we're going to build a bunch of Amazon warehouses housing their product. Like, yes, it creates some local jobs, but it's not, the job isn't the person who's doing computer coding for Amazon. And it seems like there's maybe a disconnect there that somehow having data centers physically in Minnesota creates some enhancement to our technological industry. And I don't really see that direct connection. They're housing computing equipment that's being used all over. And the jobs that are physically here are about maintaining that equipment. It's, so I don't really understand that piece. And I also just wanted to touch, Catherine, briefly on what you said about this argument that, if not here, well, won't they go to a state like North Dakota that has a much more coal-heavy electricity mix? And wouldn't that be worse because then they're using all this electricity that's keeping all of these coal plants online? I think that that's a mistaken argument. I don't think that it's a one-for-one game that, if a data center doesn't come here, it's going to North Dakota. I think data centers are looking for the best locations they can find, the most favorable conditions. We're going to have some data centers in states with better clean energy than in others. But I don't think that we should be making decisions and saying, oh, well, they need to come here because it's at least better than having them go to a different state. I think it's important for every state to be doing a cost benefit analysis, protecting their people and natural resources, and assessing, is this something that is a benefit to us? Is this something that our natural resources can actually support or not? Because I do think there is a real physical limit to how many data centers we can add in the country of the United States. And states need to be regulating in a way that reflects the physical limits of our natural resources on data centers. I think that's an important market mechanism that needs to be in place.
Yeah. And all this too points towards, again, that need for transparency, right? I mean, there are potential benefits. Let's pull these things out into the sunlight and take a look at the benefits and the drawbacks instead of the sort of, secretive or indirect permitting processes that you all have described today, or if for water and for energy and for environmental review. Really no talk at all right now happening in the state around the metals impacts. And so let's have that conversation about those potential benefits versus drawbacks. So it is 12:57. We did not get to all of your questions, but we very much appreciate that you're here today. And a couple things before we go. The first one is, remember, there is a call to action. Please do reach out to your legislature if you're concerned about this issue. The link is in our chat. Also, keep an eye on our emails. This is our legislative session. There is a ton happening. There will be other calls to action, other opportunities to get involved. So please watch out for those. Again, our work is fueled by your donations. We're doing a ton on this, and we will continue to make sure that this is a conversation that's happening in public and not behind closed doors here in Minnesota. Please help us out with a gift. It does make a big difference. And thank you again for joining us today. And thanks to Erin and Amelia also for your insights. Have a good afternoon.